to me speaks directly to someone who's been exposed to a lot of violence, and he doesn't see it as that big a thing. He's executed. So I think you can move these kind of concepts back, and what you do is give deeper meaning to the whole combat experience, if you can do this in the past. So it's not just about tactics. John Grenier's in his First Way of War talks about scalping like it's a great American pastime. He doesn't weigh the consequences of cyclical scalping back and forth amongst people. You have to see the price paid by soldiers to understand what they went through. I also argue that the soldiers could be psychologically traumatized by military discipline. There's 3 levels of discipline in the Army. There's summary punishment. If you break any sort of order, your NCO can strike you with what he has at hand. There's a regimental court-martial where you can be punished corporally, up to not harming life or limb. And then there's the general courts-martial, which are capital offenses. Arthur Gilbert did an analysis of the general court-martial cases in 7 Years' War, and he counted up the number of lashes given out. He computed that there was an average of 796 lashes on average of whippings for capital offenses. 796. You get reports of people being essentially flayed alive. People die under the whip. You get executions carried on. These whippings are often carried out specifically upon orders in front of the unit of the men who are offenders. In executions, quite often, the executions carried out in front of them, and in instances, his comrades are ordered to kill the person who's being executed. They're making it personal. All sorts of things, seeing hyper-violence committed against people you know. These are atrocities on a small scale, and they're going to have psychological trauma. What's amazing, however, is that despite all this, desertion for which you are executed or get 1,000 lashes usually is rampant. There's resistance carried on up to that extreme, such that periodically the Army has to issue proclamations forgiving all people who have deserted in hopes they'll come back. I argue that the Army here is deploying terror as a tactic to coerce its laborers into going into battle and following any order they get. And just like in civil society, the military justice uses pardons as a kind of tool to let one person off and punish another. And Douglas Hay has written about 18th century British jurisprudence that this was also a form of terror, because it put randomness into it. You didn't know whether you would die or not. And it also underlined just how much power these people had over your life. They could kill you or they could save you. General James Murray, who was at Quebec during that awful winter when scurvy was killing everyone, has a case in which 2 people were convicted and sent to be executed. He has them cast lots. The one who wins survives, the other one gets executed. So they even introduce that element of chance in there, just to make it seem so random. Another thing about that they talk about the terror tactics of guerrilla warfare is not knowing that the threat's there, that it can be unleashed on you at any time. And you get these executions where 12 people are supposed to be executed, and they go up there and they maybe kill 2 of them, but they don't tell you. So people fall down beside you and you're still there. So it's an entire theater of terror, a dramaturgy of punishment. Still, people resisted. There's even mutinies. But the biggest mutiny of all, and I've written an article on this, is the general mutiny that occurs at the end of the war. There's a really hard campaign to take Havana in 1762. 4,000 or more soldiers die there. The vast majority of them die from yellow fever. When they take it, there's this huge amount of money that they get there. And each soldier gets something like 20 shillings or something like that. And the general and the admiral each get 320,000 pounds out of this stash of plunder. They all think they're going back to Britain after this because the war's over. They're not. They're sent back to North America, and everyone's grumbling about this. And when they get back, peace is declared, and General Amherst, depicted here, on orders from on high to cut the budget, decides to make the men pay for their food. They hadn't paid for their food throughout the war. So he's going to stop their wages 4 pence a day from their 6 pence to make them pay for their own food. And this causes mutiny to erupt across this map. From Lewisburg in the top right corner down to Pensacola in Florida. I do not know how the news got from place to place, but most of the large garrisons turn out and refuse to work. Even when they're stood under arms and threatened to be shot, they refuse to work. Eventually, they forced Amherst to have to drop the stoppages from 4 pence to 2 pence. And most garrisons go back without accommodation. But Lewisburg and Newfoundland hold out throughout the winter and on into April. It's only when the king threatens to send them all back to the Caribbean, improbable death from yellow fever, that all of them except 4 soldiers buckle. Those 4 soldiers refuse to go back to work. They're sent to the Mississippi, which is almost as deadly. Life after the military. Classic images of crippled soldiers. Here on the left, crippled soldier missing 2 legs with his family, sketched in 1763, I think. Also the image of the ex-soldier turned criminal, and there's spikes in criminality after wars in this period. They debate whether it's higher enforcement or whether it is actually troops going back. There's just been a new book come out, I think by Nicholas Roger, on this phenomenon I haven't had a chance to read yet. So soldiers basically at the end of the war, they're disbanded and they're just tossed aside. Now, if you're lucky, you would get shipped back to Britain if you were from Britain. And you'd be given something like 1 day's pay to get you wherever, from wherever you landed to wherever your home was, which could be from Plymouth up to Aberdeen, Scotland. There's no sort of, for most people there's no pension. There is the pension hospital that you had to, technically you had to have 20 years of service, honorable service, to get into that, and was still competitive. But people who had lost multiple limbs would get into it with less service sometimes. But for the most part, you're just thrown out. No attempt to try to reintegrate you back into civilian society. One of the diagnostics for PTSD or psychological combat trauma is a higher incarceration rate post-military service. So there may be some truth to that phenomenon being reflected here. There are some attempts to set up soldier colonies in the New World. Some of the Highlanders around Ticonderoga, some settlement in Canada, again, mostly Scots in Quebec and then out and around Nova Scotia, but not a heck of a lot was done. And those settlements, the land was given to the officer, not to the soldiers. And with certain stipulations, I think that they would get it after a certain amount of time. So basically, you've done your service, you're thrown away. This is the military in this era. And that wraps up my presentation.